The creature that scared away. The bear I had seen grizzlies fight. I had seen them charge. I had seen them kill. But I had never seen one run away in fear. Not until that morning. I'm 48 years old. I've spent nearly 30 years hunting and guiding in grizzly country across western Montana. And if there's one thing those 30 years have taught me, it's that grizzlies do not scare easily. They're not reckless, and they're not stupid. A smart grizzly avoids unnecessary conflict the same way any smart animal does. But fear, real fear, the kind that makes an 800-pound apex predator turn and run without looking back, is not something I had ever personally witnessed in nearly 3 decades of sharing their country. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it's the single most important fact in this entire story. Everything else I'm going to tell you only matters because of what that bear did that morning. And what it did was something I still don't have a clean explanation for. I've spent my career around grizzlies in a way most people never will. I've watched boars fight over territory and over sows. Watched sows defend cubs against threats both real and imagined. Watched bears stand their ground against vehicles, aircraft, and armed men without flinching. I've come to think of them as one of the most consistently, reliably confident animals in that entire ecosystem. An animal that has very little left to genuinely fear once it reaches adulthood. That confidence is exactly what makes what I watched that morning so difficult for me to set aside. I've told this story to exactly 4 people in the years since it happened. 2 of them were other guides who, in their own careful way, told me they'd heard something similar once themselves. One was my wife, who has never once told me I was wrong, which from her is its own kind of confirmation. And one was a wildlife biologist I trust, who listened to the whole thing and told me honestly that he didn't have an answer for me either. I'm telling it now, in full, because I think enough time has passed that I can tell it carefully, without either overselling it or talking myself out of what I actually watched happen. So let me walk you through it, in the order it unfolded, because the order is the whole point. The morning. This was early September, 4 years ago, in a remote drainage in the Bitterroot Range that I knew well from years of scouting and guiding in that exact country. I was alone that morning, ahead of a guided hunt scheduled for later that week, doing what any responsible guide does before bringing a client into unfamiliar terrain, confirming game movement, checking water sources, making sure nothing about the landscape had changed enough since the previous season to catch us off guard. The morning itself was unremarkable in every way that matters for a story like this one. Clear sky, light wind out of the northwest, the kind of cool, still September air that makes for genuinely pleasant glassing conditions. I'd packed light, since this was scouting rather than hunting. Optics, water, a basic first aid kit, my rifle out of habit more than expectation, since I rarely go into that country unarmed regardless of the purpose of the trip. I'd driven nearly 2 hours that morning just to reach the trailhead, the kind of commitment that tells you something about how seriously I take the scouting work that most clients never see or think much about. I'd glassed a sow grizzly and what I took to be a yearling cub from a ridge about half a mile off, working a berry patch on a north-facing slope, the kind of unremarkable, perfectly ordinary grizzly behavior I'd watched probably 100 times over the years. Nothing about that first sighting suggested anything unusual at all. I want you to remember that, because it matters for understanding just how much things changed over the next 2 hours. I settled into a comfortable glassing position with good sight lines and decent cover, planning to spend the morning simply observing, the kind of low-stakes scouting that makes up most of an experienced guide's actual working life, regardless of how it gets portrayed in the stories people tell afterward. I remember being, if anything, a little bored in those first 40 minutes. I had no reason yet to expect that morning to be any different from 100 others I'd spent in exactly that kind of position. At the time, I thought I was watching an ordinary morning of grizzly behavior in good habitat. I was wrong, and looking back, the bear had already noticed something I hadn't, long before I had any reason to suspect anything at all. Phase 1. Something changes. About 40 minutes into my observation, the sow's behavior shifted in a way that, at first, I almost dismissed entirely. She stopped feeding. Not the way a grizzly stops feeding when it's full or moving to better forage. This was abrupt. A complete halt mid-motion, head coming up fast, body going rigid in a posture I associate with a bear that has just caught wind of something genuinely worth its attention. I've watched that posture trigger dozens of times over the years, usually toward another bear or a moose, and it almost always resolves within seconds into either renewed feeding or a clear, decisive response. This time, it didn't resolve the way I expected. I assumed she'd picked up my scent, or another hunter's, or some other bear moving through the drainage. None of that would have been remarkable. But what struck me as slightly unusual was the direction she was facing. Not toward me. Not toward the wind, which was steady out of the northwest. She was facing down drainage, toward a narrower stretch of timber that the terrain always made difficult to glass clearly, even from good vantage points. She held that posture for nearly a full minute before relaxing, though she didn't fully return to her earlier rhythm. She kept glancing back in that direction and kept moving the cub slowly away from it. I logged it mentally as unusual and kept watching. I had no idea in that moment that this was only the first of several signs that Bear was going to give me, each one a little harder to explain away than the last. Phase 2. The looking back over the next half hour, the sow's behavior settled into a pattern, and it's the pattern, more than any single moment, that started to genuinely unsettle me. She would feed for a few minutes, apparently normally, then stop and look directly behind herself, down toward that same stretch of timber, holding the posture for 10 or 15 seconds before resuming. Then she'd feed again. Then she'd stop and look again. I counted nearly a dozen of these cycles over about 25 minutes, far more sustained vigilance than I'd ever documented from a single animal toward a single fixed point. What was not normal was the consistency of the direction. Every time she stopped, she looked toward that same narrow stretch of timber, never toward me, never toward the wind, never toward any of the other directions. A genuinely randomly vigilant animal checks as routine caution. She was watching something, specifically, repeatedly, something stationary, or moving slowly enough within a confined area that she felt the need to keep tabs on it, rather than write it off. At the time, I assumed it was another bear, possibly a boar, which a sow with a cub has every reason to actively monitor and avoid. That explanation fit everything I knew, and it's the one I clung to longer than I probably should have, because it was the only one that didn't require me to consider anything stranger. What I didn't yet understand was that the sow was about to make a decision no bear monitoring a rival boar would ever actually make. She started moving away from that drainage entirely, and within minutes, I'd find myself watching something I'd never seen a grizzly do before. Phase 3. The refusal. I want to walk you through this part carefully because it's the part of the morning where I stopped being a casual observer and started genuinely paying attention. In the way you pay attention when something doesn't fit the model you've built over 30 years of watching the same species behave the same way over and over again. The sow began moving upslope, away from the narrow timber stretch, in a direction that took her and the cub toward thinner cover and less productive forage. A worse location by almost any measure a bear actually cares about. Grizzlies are efficient animals. They don't abandon good feeding ground for no reason, and they especially don't abandon it for thinner, more exposed terrain, unless something about the alternative feels more dangerous than the exposure, which is precisely the kind of trade-off I'd never personally watched a healthy bear make outside of an active, immediate threat. I remember thinking, at the time, that I was watching territorial avoidance behavior, the kind you'd expect if she genuinely believed a boar was working that same drainage. It was the explanation that required the least adjustment to everything I already understood. And so, it was the one I reached for first. The same way most people reach for the simplest available answer before they're forced to consider something more complicated. At one point, the cub, moving with the particular clumsy curiosity young bears have, started to wander back down slope, back toward that timber stretch the sow had been so fixated on, apparently untroubled by whatever had captured its mother's attention so completely. The sow's reaction was immediate and, in nearly 30 years of watching grizzly behavior, unlike anything I had seen from a sow before. She didn't just call the cub back with a vocalization, the way you'd expect, a low grunt or chuff that most cubs respond to within seconds. She moved fast, cut the distance in a few bounding strides, physically blocking the cub's path and redirecting it away from the timber with a kind of urgency that read, even from half a mile out through quality glass, as something closer to alarm than ordinary parental correction. I remember lowering my binoculars for a second, just to register what I'd actually watched. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't yet have any concrete idea what was happening down in that drainage. What I had was a sow grizzly behaving like that specific stretch of timber was off limits, in a way I had genuinely never observed before. In country, I genuinely thought I understood. Looking back, that wasn't even the warning that bothered me most. I didn't realize it at the time, but the sow had already made her decision about that timber long before this moment. What I was watching wasn't her deciding anything new. It was her managing a threat she'd already concluded was real. That's when I first started paying close attention to the timber itself, rather than to the bear. Phase 4. What I started to notice. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the morning where the mystery stopped being only about the bear's behavior and became something I was independently starting to register myself, through my own observation rather than through hers. I shifted my glass toward that stretch of timber the sow had been so consistently focused on, and at first, I genuinely saw nothing. Just typical mixed conifer, the kind of moderately dense cover you find throughout that whole range. Nothing visually remarkable from half a mile out. I want to be honest that I spent several minutes simply scanning back and forth across that stretch, half expecting to feel a little foolish for taking a bear's vigilance this seriously in the first place. But as I kept watching, I started to notice things that, individually, I might have dismissed, and that together started to form a pattern I couldn't quite ignore. First, there was a sound, distant, irregular, carried on and off by the wind in a way that made it hard to pin down exactly what I was hearing, but heavy enough that it didn't match anything I associated with smaller animals moving through that kind of cover. A few cracks of breaking branches, spaced unevenly, the kind of sound you get from something significant moving with real mass, not the lighter, quicker sounds of deer or elk threading through brush. I remember holding perfectly still for almost a full minute, just listening, trying to separate that sound from the ordinary creak of wind in the canopy, which is its own kind of difficult exercise when you're half a mile out, and the wind itself won't hold steady long enough to give you a clean baseline. Second, and this took me longer to notice because it required actually scanning the tree line carefully rather than just listening. There were 2 or 3 places where smaller trees had been bent or snapped at heights that struck me as unusual. Not down low, the way deadfall typically breaks under snow load or wind, but higher, at heights that would put the point of breakage roughly chest height on a standing man, sometimes higher still. One of those breaks, a sapling no thicker than my wrist, had been snapped clean rather than torn, the kind of break you get from a single decisive force rather than something simply leaning against it over time. I want to be honest that, at the time, I didn't immediately connect this to anything specific. My first working theory was a large bull elk thrashing brush during the early stages of the rut, which can absolutely produce exactly that kind of damage at exactly that kind of height. It was a reasonable theory. It fit the season. It fit the sound, more or less. What I found later that morning made that theory considerably harder to hold on to. Phase 5. The tracks. I want to tell you about the moment everything shifted from an interesting behavioral puzzle into something I genuinely could not stop thinking about, even years later. After close to an hour of watching this play out from a distance, curiosity got the better of my caution, the way it sometimes does even after 30 years of experience that should, in theory, have taught me better. I made the decision to work my way down toward that stretch of timber myself, carefully, downwind, the way you'd approach any area you suspected might hold game, or, in this case, whatever had a grizzly sow that unsettled. It took me close to 40 minutes of careful movement to reach the edge of that timber, moving the way you move when you genuinely don't know what's ahead of you, stopping often, glassing every clearing before crossing it, letting the wind tell me as much as my eyes could. What I found there is something I have described exactly the same way every single time I've told this story, because I've never needed to adjust the details. They were too specific to need adjusting. There was a track, partial but clear, in a patch of exposed soil at the edge of a game trail. I want to be precise about what I'm telling you, because precision is the only kind of credibility I have to offer. I've tracked elk, deer, moose, and bear in that exact range for nearly 30 years. I know what every one of those tracks looks like in every condition I'm likely to encounter them in mud, in dust, in thin snow, in the kind of compacted soil that holds detail for days. This print did not match any of them. It was bipedal, or at minimum showed weight distribution and toe positioning consistent with a two-legged gait rather than four, significantly larger than any boot print I could reasonably attribute to a person, with a depth in that soil suggesting a mass well beyond what I weighed myself. And I am not a small man. I crouched there for a long time, the way you do when your own eyes are presenting you with something your training has no category for. I photographed it on my phone from several angles, with my own boot placed alongside it for scale in at least 2 of those shots. I measured it against a small ruler I always carry clipped to my pack for exactly this kind of comparison, an old habit from years of documenting game sign for clients who want more than just my word for what we'd found. About 15 feet further along that same game trail, partially obscured under a screen of low brush I almost walked past without checking, I found a second print. Fainter than the first, missing most of the heel, but unmistakably matching it in width and in that same unusual toe spacing. The distance between the 2 prints, accounting for the obscured ground between them, suggested a stride length that, again, simply did not match anything walking on 4 legs, and didn't match a man either. I spent several minutes after that comparing both prints against everything I actually knew about grizzly tracks in that exact substrate. The kind of careful, almost stubborn cross-checking you do when you want very badly for a strange thing to turn out to be an ordinary thing wearing an unfamiliar face. Grizzly tracks in that kind of soil at that time of year leave a distinctive claw registration well ahead of the toe pads, and a heel pad shape I could have sketched from memory after 30 years of looking at it. Neither print showed any of that. What they showed instead was something closer to a human heel and arch pattern, scaled up well beyond anything human, with toes positioned in a way that read as genuinely bipedal rather than as a forepaw print mistaken for one. I did not yet understand what had made that bear run, but I understood, for the first time that morning, that whatever it was real, physical, and large enough to leave behind evidence that didn't require any imagination at all to take seriously. That single fact changed the entire character of the morning for me. Up until that point, I'd been documenting unusual behavior. From that moment forward, I was tracking something, and I was doing it on foot, alone, with whatever daylight I had left. What I found near that game trail changed how I interpreted everything that had come before it. The vigilance, the redirected cub, even the broken branches. All of it stopped reading to me as a string of separate oddities, and started reading as a single, coherent account of one specific, physical thing moving through that drainage. Phase 6. The agitation. I want to back up slightly in the timeline here, because something happened with the sow shortly before I made my approach, and I think it matters that you understand it happened first, before I had any of the physical evidence I just described to you. In the final few minutes before I started my own approach, the sow's behavior escalated past vigilance into something I would describe, without hesitation, as genuine agitation. She began pacing in short, tight movements head low, ears pinned in a posture I associate far more with a defensive, cornered animal than a confident one surveying her territory. She vocalized, not a full warning bark, but something quieter, more clipped, the kind of low huffing sound bears make when they're deciding, in real time, whether a situation requires fight or flight. I'd heard that exact sound before, a handful of times over the years, almost always in the moments right before a bear made a clear, decisive choice one way or the other. What made this different was how long it went on. Most of the times I'd heard it, the bear resolved the tension within 30 seconds or so. This stretched on for several minutes, the pacing and the huffing repeating in a loop that never quite broke into either direction. The cub, picking up on her mother's tension the way young animals reliably do, pressed close against her side, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood there, rigid, facing that same stretch of timber. Mother and cub both frozen in an identical posture that struck me, even at half a mile, as something close to genuine dread. I had never, in nearly 30 years, watched a grizzly hold that posture for that long without it resolving into either a clear threat response or a return to calm. This was neither. This was a bear caught in an extended state of uncertainty about something I still hadn't identified myself. I remember thinking, watching her through the glass, that I was looking at something closer to indecision than fear, and it would take the next 60 seconds to teach me how wrong that red was. I want you to understand that everything I'm describing here happened before I found the tracks. The bear knew, or at minimum reacted as though it knew, that something in that timber represented a serious threat, well before I had any concrete evidence to support that conclusion myself. Looking back, I think the bear understood the actual danger in that drainage significantly faster than I did, and significantly more accurately. I didn't realize it at the time, but by the point I was crouched at the edge of that game trail measuring a single print, the sow had already moved through every stage of that realization herself, hours, or maybe only minutes, ahead of me. Phase 7. The flight. What happened next is the moment that gives this story its title, and it's the single clearest piece of behavioral evidence I have, because unlike everything before it, there was no ambiguity at what I watched. The sow's agitated pacing stopped abruptly. She went rigid for perhaps 2 full seconds, staring fixed at a specific point in the timber that I could not, from my position, identify clearly myself, no matter how hard I tried to follow her exact line of sight. And then she ran. Not a deliberate retreat. Not the unhurried, confident withdrawal you sometimes see from a dominant bear, simply choosing to avoid a confrontation it doesn't need. The kind of withdrawal I'd documented plenty of times before, without it meaning much of anything beyond ordinary caution. A full, committed run, the cub struggling to keep pace beside her, both of them covering ground away from that timber with a kind of urgency I have never witnessed from a grizzly before or since, in any context, including direct encounters with other aggressive bears, including, on one memorable occasion years earlier, a genuine charge from a different sow that I'd startled at close range. I watched her cross nearly 300 yards of open slope, without slowing once, without looking back, until she and the cub disappeared over a ridge and out of my sight line entirely. The whole sprint couldn't have taken more than 30 seconds, but it stayed with me in a kind of slow-motion clarity that 30 seconds rarely earns in memory. I sat there for a long moment, glass still raised, trying to process what I had just watched. In nearly 30 years of guiding and hunting in grizzly country, I had genuinely never seen anything provoke that specific response from an adult sow. Not other bears, not hunters, not vehicles, aircraft, or any of the usual sources of disturbance that bears in that range have learned to tolerate or actively avoid in far less dramatic fashion. I tried, sitting there, to think of a single comparable moment from 3 decades of field work, and I genuinely could not produce one. Something in that timber had frightened an 800-pound grizzly enough to make her run in genuine, uncomplicated fear. And I still hadn't seen it myself. Every part of that fact felt backward to me. Sitting there with my glass still raised, the predator fleeing, and the man with the rifle still curious enough to go looking for whatever had done the frightening. I want you to sit in that uncertainty with me for just a moment longer, because I sat in it myself for several minutes before I made the decision that led to what I'm about to describe. I had every reason to simply leave. I had 2 tracks, a fled bear, broken branches, and a sound I couldn't identify. By any reasonable standard, that should have been enough information to make the responsible choice and walk away. It wasn't enough for me. Not that morning. 30 years of careful habits should have sent me back up the ridge to my truck. Instead, I found myself moving closer, telling myself I'd just take one careful look and no more. The way curiosity always convinces a person it can be contained to exactly the amount they intend to allow it. I've thought about that decision more than almost any other single choice I made that day, because it's the moment where I stopped simply documenting what the bear already understood and started insisting on understanding it myself. I want to be honest that part of what pulled me forward was professional pride, the kind that's hard to admit to on camera. 30 years of reading sign in that exact country had built a quiet confidence in me that I could identify almost anything I came across out there. A morning like this one that refused to fit any category I already had, was its own kind of provocation. I didn't like not knowing. I still don't, if I'm honest, even 4 years removed from it. I checked the wind one more time, confirmed it was still steady in my favor, and started moving, slower than I needed to, the way a careful man moves when curiosity has already won the argument, but caution hasn't fully given up trying. The reveal. I want to tell you exactly what happened next, because this is the part of the story I've turned over more times than any other single moment of that morning. After the sow fled, I held my position for several minutes, working through, as calmly as I could manage, exactly what my next move should be. Every instinct built over 30 years told me that whatever had frightened a grizzly, they completely deserved more caution than curiosity. But I had already found the tracks. I had already heard the sounds, seen the broken trees. I was, by that point, fully committed to understanding what I was dealing with, even if every rational part of my training was telling me to simply leave. I moved closer, slowly, staying low, using what cover the terrain offered, working my way toward the edge of that timber stretch from a slightly different angle than my first approach. And that's when I saw it. It was upright. That's the detail that struck me before almost anything else, because nothing about the posture matched a bear, even at a distance, even through brush that broke up my sightline considerably. It stood with a kind of sustained, balanced verticality that no bear achieves except briefly, rearing onto its hind legs for a few seconds before dropping back down. This held that posture continuously, moving through the timber with deliberate, unhurried steps. I want to give you my honest, immediate assessment of size, while acknowledging the obvious limitations of estimating mass and height through partial cover at a distance under real stress. It was substantially larger than a man, broader through the chest and shoulders than any human frame I've encountered, with proportions that read as wrong for a person in a way I can't fully articulate, beyond saying that 30 years of looking at actual human silhouettes in actual outdoor settings had built an instinct in me that fired immediately and unambiguously the moment I saw this. It was covered in what appeared to be a dark, coarse coat, consistent with the kind of build that could plausibly account for both the tracks I'd found and the height at which those branches had been broken. It did not see me, or if it did, it gave no indication of having registered my presence at all. It moved through that timber at its own pace, unhurried, and within perhaps 30 seconds, it had passed beyond a fold in the terrain and out of my line of sight entirely. I never saw it again that day, or any day since. What I didn't expect to find. I want to tell you about something else I noticed that morning, something that has nothing directly to do with the creature itself, and something that has bothered me almost as much in the years since, precisely because I have never been able to connect it to anything. When I finally made my way back to where I'd left my pack during my initial approach, I discovered that a small piece of gear was missing. Not my rifle, not anything critical to getting myself out of that drainage safely, but a compact set of binoculars I always carry as a backup, clipped to a loop on the outside of my pack, specifically, so I wouldn't lose track of them. The clip was still attached, still functional, still closed the way it's designed to close. The binoculars themselves were simply gone, and I have never found a satisfying account of how that clip could have released without being deliberately opened, or how anything could have removed those binoculars without leaving the kind of disturbance to the surrounding pack and straps that I would have noticed immediately. I searched the immediate area for a reasonable amount of time, retracing my own steps from where I'd left the pack, checking the brush in a widening circle, even backtracking part of my original approach in case they'd worked loose earlier and I simply hadn't noticed. I found nothing. No binoculars, no drag marks, no indication of how or where they might have gone, and soft ground that should have held some kind of trace if they'd simply been knocked loose and rolled somewhere nearby. I've never been able to explain that loss in a way that satisfies me. It's entirely possible there's a mundane answer I'm simply missing. A clip that failed in a way I didn't notice. A moment of carelessness on my own part that I genuinely don't remember, given how much else was competing for my attention that morning. I hold that possibility seriously. But I want to be honest, that of everything that happened that day, that small, almost mundane mystery is the detail that has nagged at me the most consistently, precisely because it has no dramatic weight to it at all. It's just a fact I cannot account for, sitting quietly alongside everything else I also can't account for. I've wondered more than once whether something curious enough to investigate my pack while I was occupied elsewhere might also have been careful enough to leave everything else undisturbed. I don't offer that as an explanation. I offer it only as the kind of thought that keeps a man up later than he'd like, turning a small, ordinary loss over and over in his mind, long after the larger, stranger parts of the story have settled into something he's learned to live with. The evidence I kept. I want to tell you about the tracks again, because they're the one piece of physical evidence from that morning that exists independently of my own memory, and because I think it matters that you understand exactly what I did and didn't do with them afterward. I photographed both prints from multiple angles before I left the area, and I measured each one carefully against a ruler I keep clipped to my pack for exactly that purpose. I also, before leaving, did something I don't often do. I sketched the surrounding terrain in a small notebook I carry, noting the position of the broken branches relative to both prints, the direction the sow had fled, and the rough location where I'd seen the creature disappear over the terrain fold. I shared those photographs with the wildlife biologist I mentioned earlier, a man with real field credentials and no particular reputation for entertaining wild theories. He examined them carefully, asked detailed questions about substrate conditions and recent weather, and told me honestly that he could not confidently attribute those prints to any known species in that ecosystem, while being careful to note that 2 partial prints, without a verified cast or a second observer's corroboration, don't meet any reasonable scientific standard of proof. I want to honor that caution because I think it's the right caution to have. I'm not a biologist. I'm a hunting guide with 3 decades of field experience, and a single morning I still can't fully explain. I want to bring up the binoculars again here, because I think they belong in the same conversation as the tracks. A missing print in soft ground is one kind of mystery. A missing object, with an intact clip and no trace of how it left my pack, is a different kind entirely. And it's the one I've never been able to set down. What I can tell you, without any hesitation at all, is what I watched that grizzly sow do, in broad daylight, through quality optics, from a stable position, over the better part of 2 hours. I watched her notice something I hadn't yet noticed myself. I watched her grow increasingly agitated by its continued presence, and I watched her flee from it in a way I have never witnessed a grizzly flee from anything else, before or since. Why I'm telling you this now? I've thought about that morning more times than I can count in the 4 years since it happened, and I've held every conventional explanation up against my own memory with as much honesty as I can manage. It's possible the tracks belong to an unusually large animal in conditions that distorted their appearance beyond what I, despite my experience, could correctly interpret. It's possible the broken branches had some mundane cause I simply failed to identify. It's possible, even, that what I saw moving through that timber in the final moments was something my own stress and adrenaline reshaped into something stranger than it actually was. Though I want to be honest that this explanation has never fully satisfied me, given how clearly I remember that sustained, upright gait. What I cannot explain away, no matter how many times I try, is the bear. Grizzlies do not perform fear for an audience. They don't run from nothing. In nearly 30 years of studying their behavior as closely as my profession requires, I have never found a single instance, in my own experience, or in the experience of any guide I respect, of a healthy adult, Grizzly fleeing in genuine panic from an ordinary, explainable disturbance. That sow understood something about that stretch of timber long before I did. She gave me every signal available to her: the vigilance, the redirected cub, the agitation, and finally the flight. And I spent the better part of 2 hours slowly, reluctantly catching up to a conclusion she had apparently reached almost immediately. I don't know exactly what was moving through that drainage that morning. I've made what peace I can with that uncertainty over the past 4 years. The same uncertainty I imagine that biologist has made his own peace with, in his own careful, evidence-respecting way. What I do know, with a certainty that 4 years hasn't worn down at all, is that something in those mountains frightened an apex predator more completely than I have ever personally witnessed in nearly 30 years of sharing that same country with animals that fear almost nothing else at all. I still go back into that range every season. I still glass that same general drainage, more out of habit than expectation. I've never seen the sow again, not for certain, though I've wondered more than once whether a particular wary, watchful bear I glassed 2 seasons later, working a different slope entirely, might have been her, older now, carrying whatever memory a bear carries of a morning like that one. I don't know what scared that bear. I only know that whatever it was, it never showed itself to me directly, never approached, never gave any indication of aggression toward anything, except, perhaps, whatever idea of danger a grizzly sow happens to carry in her own mind. I still don't know what happened to those binoculars. I've stopped expecting to. Some mornings, I think that small, unsolved loss bothers me more than the tracks or the creature itself, precisely because it offers nothing to interpret, no posture, no upright gait to weigh against 30 years of field experience. Just an empty clip and a gap in my own account of that morning I have never been able to close. It simply walked through that timber, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with the fact that it had just emptied an entire drainage of the one animal that, by every rule I understood about that ecosystem, should have had nothing left to fear at all.